Hues of the Horizon is a short story that I wrote my senior year of high school. It is about 6,000 words long, 3 chapters long, and I'm going to read it to you. I hope you enjoy. Hues of the Horizon, Chapter 1. The sun hung over the horizon in front of Figaro, as it had for the past 3 days, a bright orb of death. Burning, lifeless desert stretched out as far as he could see, a lethal location if not for the wooden pendants hanging on his and his allies' necks. To Figaro's right, Margot clutched his pendant in his large hand, his nervousness betraying his massive form. When were we supposed to be there, Figs? The necklaces might not last much longer, Margot said, staring at him. Rimshaw chuckled from inside the wooden wagon, his shrill voice replying, "You buffoon! You ask that every day. Can't you remember a simple number?" Figaro sighed, tired of Margot's constant questions and Rimshaw's constant insults. "As I already said, Margot, we're going 4 days out from the belt. That's where the rock rats live. We've been out for 3 days, so we only have one more rest before we get there. We have plenty of pendants. If we need to conserve them, then we'll just take a few from the slaves." Pulling the wagon was a group of 4 men, wearing nothing except loincloths and pendants. Their eyes were glued to the horizon. On the side of each of their necks were intricate patterns that had been burned onto their skin. It was a mark, one that removed enough of their thoughts that they would act how they were told to. A similar mark was painted on the pendants, except that one allowed its wearers to resist the immense heat surrounding them. Without it, they would burn. Rimshaw lazily lay in the interior of the wagon, enjoying the shade. He often took breaks from the endless walking, but insisted that his rest not halt the progress of the group. He would spend hours in the cramped wagon, fidgeting with the variety of tools they brought with them as the rest of the company pushed their way through the hills of sand and dirt. Luckily, the only things he broke were things that they could repair. Figaro looked up towards the light blue sky, searching for the moon. It was difficult to see it in the desert. One had to have a keen eye for colors and an understanding of the moon's path to the sky. A small sphere of gray caught his eye. The moon had already made significant progress through the sky. "Day's over, friends. The moon has arrived." With a loud command to stop by Rimshaw, the slaves slowed and set down their bars. They stood there motionless until Rimshaw commanded them to set up camp. The slaves climbed into the wagon and pulled out the thick blankets used to block the sun. Margot steps aside awkwardly as the slaves pulled the blankets next to the wagon, stabbing long metal sticks into the rough dirt to elevate the edges. Margot crept towards Figaro. "Figs, I'm a little thirsty. Could I make some more water?" "Rimshaw has the water staff." Figaro nodded, his head towards the wagon. Rimshaw stepped partly out of the wagon, his thin frame tense and his round face full of fear. "I don't have the water staff. I thought you had it." Figaro's heart skipped a beat. It had been several hours since they last used it. If they had dropped it then, they wouldn't have enough pendants to both hunt the rock rats and make it back to the belt safely. A wide smile appeared on Rimshaw's face. "I'm joking, Figaro. It's in the wagon." He ducked away and appeared a second later with a long wooden staff. Labyrinth marks speckled the length of it in dark red paint, like tangles of bloody vines. Rimshaw tossed it towards Margot, who grabbed it eagerly. Margot walked several long paces out of the camp and pierced the ground with the end of the water staff. One of the marks near the top of the staff began to shine a dull red light. The tip of the staff sunk into the floor as the dirt it touched turned clear. Water spread out several meters away from Margot until a small, clear pond lay in front of him. The glow on the wood faded, taking the mark with it. Margot stirred the water with the staff for a minute, allowing the minerals in the ground to mix with the clear liquid, then walked back to the wagon to grab his cup. Rimshaw gazed at the pond with barely hidden jealousy. "Margot, how can a fool like you activate marks?" Margot stopped, cup in hand with a confused expression. "I thought I told you. The Opal priests accept anyone who helped them with their duties." he said in a deep yet childlike voice. He pulled his shirt down at his neck to reveal an intricate tattoo under his collarbone. See, I even got the mark of acceptance. Rimshaw rolled his eyes. That was a rhetorical question you didn't need to answer. Figaro pushed past Margot and grabbed a cup. He marched to the pond and drank. There was barely a taste, as usual. The desert didn't allow for such luxury. He sauntered to a tent, the slaves who assembled it standing at its rear, stiff like a doll. Drink some water. The slaves silently left to satiate their unspoken thirst. Figaro never liked sleeping when they were around. He never felt truly safe. He lied down, welcoming the embrace of sleep, the subdued heat of the desert acting as his blanket. Figaro woke up to a kick to his side. He turned to yell at Rimshaw, only to meet the eyes of the brawny, shirtless man, one of the slaves. His long, messy hair was caked in dirt. There was a large burn scar spanning his tan chest, the remnants of a tattoo curling at its upper edges. A scream pierced through Figaro's lips, followed immediately by Rimshaw's laugh from another tent. Figaro scooted away from it, keeping an eye on the figure, but the slave gaze never faltered from the ground beneath it. Figaro turned angrily towards Rimshaw, who held a proud smirk on his face. Rimshaw threw his hands up and exclaimed, "If slaves aren't to be used for pranks, why did we bring them?" Figaro opened up his mouth to answer, but forced himself quiet when Rimshaw's smirk widened. Margot leapt out of the wagon, a crate of pendants in his arms. Figaro walked away from Rimshaw and grabbed one of the pendants. Each one would only last a day, so they needed to use a fresh one after waking up. Margot walked to Rimshaw, who took a pendant and to each slave, placing the pendants around their necks. He gave one of the slaves a crate and began activating each of the pendants with a brief burst of light. The expired pendants were discarded, their marks fading. Minutes later, with their supplies packed in the wagon, the group began to trek further into the desert. Hours passed until Figaro spotted the first hole. He stopped the slaves and stepped forward to meet the cramped pit. Rock rats lived in the burrows underground in order to avoid the desert heat. They also had a thick, heat-resistant armor that prevented them from overheating when they were above ground. That hide was what made rock rat hunting lucrative. Anyone who traveled away from the belt were willing to pay a high price for a long-term solution to temperature. Figaro looked at his companions. I'll take care of this hole. You two find other exits." The others nodded. As they searched, Figaro grabbed a heavy box the size of his head from the wagon. The trap wasn't anything special. It had a small hole in one of its sides which replicated an exit for escape and used springs to kill the first creature to enter it. Other hunters preferred marks to capture or kill their prey, but Figaro always found mechanical traps to be more reliable. Figaro sat on the edge of the wagon after all the traps had been set. He wiped sweat off his forehead, leaving a dirt stain. His body refused to not sweat after hard work, despite the pendants making overheating impossible. Margot stood above a rock rat tunnel several lengths away, water staff in hand. Figaro closed his eyes, readying himself for the show. Figaro enjoyed hearing his trap spring. It brought a sense of accomplishment that little else did. Margot pierced the earth next to a tunnel entrance with the staff, a mark shining red. The dirt became water and rushed into the hole, disappearing as soon as it appeared. Margot strode casually towards the wagon as the first traps began to trigger. Squeals of pain and displeasure sprang forth like a symphony as waves of rock rats attempted to escape. Slowly, the music faded until the desert was silent. The hunt was complete. Rimshaw stepped forward, brandishing a short skinning knife and a long smile. 3 days passed as uneventful as the previous 4. Fortunately, the companions dined themselves on a delicacy of rock rat meat, cooked slowly in the sunlight as they slept. Sitting on the edge of the wagon, Figaro slowly chewed the juicy meat as Margot passed out the daily pendants. This would be the last of such rituals before they arrived back to the belt. After 7 days of travel, Figaro grew tired of the constant brightness of the desert. He closed his eyes, visualizing wide, grassy plains engulfed in mesmerizing twilight. The opal palace rose high in the distance, a crystal star catching the sunlight at the building's apex. He missed the times when he would lay in the open field and stare at the eternal sunset. A noise dissolved the tree. It wasn't loud, but it didn't come from the camp. Figaro opened his eyes and looked at the area around him. The vast desert lay before him, bare of anything that could make sound. He turns towards Margot, who handed the crate of pendants to the scarred slave, the one who had kicked Figaro days ago. Another slave awkwardly held the recently used water staff. Did you hear anything weird? Margot looked up and shook his head, confused. I didn't hear nothing. The pendant on the scarred slave burst with light. Rimshaw looked up from his tent, readying a witty response, but decided against it. Figaro gazed back to where he heard the noise and squinted his eyes. After a few moments, he finally saw it. A line of brown, like a lanky dead bush, rose out of the ground on a nearby hill. Then it rose above the ground. It was a bow. An arrow rose from the ground, its holder invisible. Figaro turned around to yell as the arrow pierced his skull. Rimshaw screamed as Figaro collapsed in front of him, an arrow jutting out above his ear. He turned to Margot, who stared at the body. Panicking, Rimshaw tried to cry out to him, but his voice came out stuttering and unclear. An arrow hit Margot's stomach. Finally, Rimshaw found his words. Margot, run! Hide! The message was brief, obvious, and ineffective. Margot turned towards him, tears in his eyes as the four slaves around him began to run away. Ironically, they, not Margot, took Rimshaw's cry to heart. Another arrow brutally killed Margot, and a second one killed Rimshaw moments later.